Hi, I'm Jeni Taylor, and I played trumpet in the Winnipeg Jazz Orchestra and the Winnipeg Women's Jazz Orchestra. As part of the Winnipeg Jazz Orchestra's ongoing celebration of International Women's Day, I've compiled a presentation that includes some of the most important women instrumentalists to impact the world of big band. Even though the heyday of big band swing was in the 1940s, big bands have obviously continued into modern times and modern styles. And the tendency of historical jazz records to stop acknowledging the existence of big bands after World War II basically writes women instrumentalists out of this history. In examining the history of jazz, it's important to acknowledge our own intrinsic biases, as well as societal biases, both historically and currently. Unfortunately, because of past discrimination, our ability to not perpetuate injustices is hindered, unless we make a conscious effort to overcome the difficulty in finding source materials. In an oral art form, it's very difficult to judge contribution, let alone skill, when there are no recordings of certain groups or classes of people from earlier time periods. It's somewhat instinctive to then assume that skill and polish is what has earned a person or band a place in the canon of jazz history, but that's an oversimplification of our history. Many other factors play into whether and how we remember musicians of the past. For example, the earliest recordings of jazz music are mostly by white men. We've come to accept the fact that African Americans were largely the ones who developed ragtime and jazz despite the lack of recorded evidence. Even though there are no recordings of Buddy Bolden, and Bunk Johnson's first recordings were made in 1942 after he had lost his teeth, no one disputes their role in the development of early jazz music. We still have not agreed upon a canon of important women in the early days of jazz, but there's no doubt that women were present in all styles of jazz music and on every instrument from quite early, despite a lack of recorded examples. Both singers and pianists seem to be more acceptable to the audience palate, and we are aware of more of these women: blues singers, including Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, and pianists, including Lil Hardin Armstrong and Lovey Austin, to name just a few. This does not imply that there was no bias against these women, but they seem more able to make lucrative careers despite, and maybe even because of, being sexually objectified by patriarchal male critics, audience members, and other musicians. Pianists and players of the pluck strings were among the first instrumentalists to overcome some of the disapproval directed toward female performers, as those instruments were generally played in a demure manner to accompany the voice. The violin was also considered acceptable relatively early, as it could be played with the least amount of physical struggle. Largely because of the absence of facial contortion, for a long time the flute was the only blown instrument considered socially acceptable for women. When women played other instruments, they made themselves vulnerable to sarcasm and ridicule, and although they might be tolerated, they were still not widely respected. 19th century music critic Philip Hale stated that even though every cultivated maiden is musical, she should stick to what is simple and not try to be a virtuoso. It was accepted for women to play certain instruments, but not to excel at them or pursue playing them professionally. The biggest, loudest, and most technologically advanced instruments are the ones from which women have been most vehemently discouraged. Among these, the brass instruments have been particularly off-limits. An anonymous critic wrote in Musical America in 1906, "Seeing a woman get red in the face blowing into a brass instrument is likely to prove an unpleasant shock." Luckily, the pioneer jazzwomen paid no heed to these critics. Known as the Lady Who Swings the Band, Mary Lou Williams was one of the greatest jazz pianists, composers, and arrangers of all time. Williams was born in Atlanta, Georgia, but moved to Pittsburgh at the age of 4. She learned piano from her mother and excelled at ragtime, boogie-woogie, and blues styles, as well as classical piano. She began playing professionally soon after, even helping to support her family by playing at parties. Her earliest influences include Jelly Roll Morton, Earl Hines, and Fats Waller. At age 13, Williams went on tour with Duke Ellington's Washingtonians, and in 1926, at the age of 15, she went on tour with a vaudeville show that eventually led her to Kansas City, where her then husband was a member of the Dark Clouds of Joy Orchestra. By 1930, Mary Lou Williams was regularly playing with the band, which had come to be known as Andy Kirk and his 12 Clouds of Joy. Largely due to Williams' original compositions, as well as her arrangements of popular tunes, the band came to epitomize the early Kansas City sound. Songs such as Mary's Idea and Froggy Bottom helped the Clouds of Joy achieve national attention and renown. She also wrote Walkin' and Swingin' for this group, which later became a hit for Duke Ellington. By 1942, Williams left Andy Kirk and was playing and composing on a freelance basis for such big-name swing acts as Benny Goodman, Earl Hines, Tommy Dorsey, Louis Armstrong, and Duke Ellington. Goodman tried repeatedly to sign her to an exclusive contract, but she refused, preferring the freedom of working freelance. Her early compositional style was known for creative harmonies and unique groupings of instruments. In the early 1940s, Williams began mentoring and collaborating with new young jazz musicians in New York City as the ideas for a new musical form were developed. Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk both cite Williams as an influence on their own compositional and playing styles. Williams integrated this new style, known as bebop, into her big band compositions as well, incorporating extended improvisation sections, fast tempos, and increasingly complex harmonic language. In this period, Williams co-led a big band with her second husband, Shorty Baker, and also led an all-women group that included notable jazz guitarist Mary Osborne. She was hosting a weekly radio show in New York at this time called Mary Lou Williams' Piano Workshop. Her 12-movement piece, Zodiac Suite, written between 1942 and 45, is a very early example of third-stream jazz, characterized by a huge influence from Western classical music. It was premiered by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra in 1945. Williams went on a hiatus from performing in the 1950s and 60s. Many attributed her burnout to despair after the death of her very close friend Charlie Parker. In this time, she converted to Catholicism along with Dizzy Gillespie's wife Lorraine. Her later compositions reflected this change. She wrote many hymns and a mass. Throughout her career, Williams was also a teacher. In informal sessions with early beboppers, in public schools in the New York area, and finally as artist-in-residence at Duke University. She was a passionate advocate for educating African Americans about their own musical heritage, even recording an album called The History of Jazz, which combined music and speech intended to educate listeners about the evolution of jazz. She was devoted to making sure that the African American roots of jazz were not forgotten as the music gained popularity with white audiences. Mary Lou Williams was simply one of the most influential women of all time in jazz music. Her career spanned over 60 years, and her playing and compositional styles reflect all of the style changes that occurred in those years, from early stride playing, swing bands, bebop, hard bop, post bop, fusion, third stream, and avant-garde jazz. Not many other instrumentalists made as much of an impact in as broad a range of styles and eras. Notably, Miles Davis is the one that I can think of. At the height of the swing era, there were hundreds of all-female bands in educational, recreational, and professional settings. These bands were categorized by race, white bands and black bands, with black seeming to encompass all races except white. Bands were marketed in very different ways depending on the racial makeup of the players, but tended to center on archetypal female stereotypes. White bands were often reduced to bombshell or angel stereotypes, where black bands often were hypersexualized Jezebels, tragic mulattoes, or mammy stereotypes. The images of skilled or educated race women would have been unintelligible to white audiences accustomed to the belief that black women were either tragic, funny, or erotic. All-girl bands were marketed as spectacles. They were rarely recorded. Reviewers often treated concerts as though they were visual rather than auditory, frivolous rather than serious. And at times, even the musicians themselves stressed their physical allure over their musicianship. One all-female band even billed themselves as the band with a bosom. Unfortunately, this has led to a general disregard for all-female bands and a subsequent dearth of information about them. Despite the fact that recollections may not always be accurate, oral histories of women musicians by the musicians themselves are often the only source we have for any history at all, because women, particularly those marginalized by more than their gender alone, have been systematically left out of the canon of jazz musicians. This, despite the fact that several women in jazz histories have now documented participation on every instrument and in every phase of jazz musicianship. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm was the most recorded of the black all-girl bands. The Sweethearts were originally the school band at Piney Woods Country Life School, a boarding school for poor and orphan students in rural Mississippi. The school had choirs, a concert band, and marching bands before starting a jazz band. The jazz band began touring in 1938, playing concerts and raising money for the school. The first inception of the band included 15 players, ranging in age from 14 to 19. Some had previously played in the band and/or marching band, and some were new to their instruments. The Sweethearts toured the South extensively. They were accompanied by a chaperone, a tutor, and their music director, trumpet player Edna White. As their popularity increased, the scope of their tours got larger. Eventually, the band brought in so much money, they were the main source of income for the whole school. As the players realized their worth, the women sought to be paid a decent wage for their efforts. At first, the band was earning around $3,000 per month, and individuals were paid just $8 a week. So if you do the math, 8 times 15 musicians is $120 a week, or a little over $500 a month. So leaving $2,500 for expenses and all remaining profit going back to the school. The women were dissatisfied with this arrangement and eventually broke away from the school to become a professional ensemble. The Sweethearts were probably the most racially integrated of all the 1940s all-girl bands, including Black, White, Chinese, Puerto Rican, Hawaiian, Jewish, Native American, and Mexican members. They regularly broke Jim Crow laws when they played in the South because of this integration. Having members from such diverse ethnic backgrounds also meant that the Sweethearts tended to be lighter-skinned or even white passing, which made them more acceptable to some audiences, notably middle-class, upwardly mobile Black audiences. Many of the later members of the ensemble were never students at Pineywood School. In its 11 years of existence, the International Sweethearts of Rhythm employed 22 trumpet players. Most made careers as professional players in some capacity, many in colored women's orchestras and bands of the era, some others as jazz soloists. There were upwards of 230 Black newspapers in the U.S. during the war years, with about 2 million readers. At times, these papers could be guilty of biases privileging middle-class upward mobility that tended to promote a kind of Black female beauty that depends on light skin. They tended toward descriptions of Black female bands as aggressively moral, avoiding the hypersexualization that had at times pervaded descriptions of jazz singers. Write-ups about performances appeared prominently in the entertainment pages of these Black newspapers in the 1930s and 40s, but until the 1980s, the Sweethearts and other Black all-female bands were largely ignored by the jazz historiography and were virtually unknown by any white audiences, despite extensive touring schedules and tremendous commercial success. Other Black bands included the Prairie View Coeds from Prairie View College, a historically Black college in Houston, Texas, the Harlem Playgirls, which was a swing band formed in the early 1930s that toured the Midwest on the Toba circuit, the Dixie Sweethearts, Eddie Durham's all-girl orchestra, the Darlings of Rhythm, and the Swing and Rays of Rhythm, which was the band that replaced the International Sweethearts at Piney Woods. The temptation arises again to assume that the International Sweethearts of Rhythm were the best players and the most polished ensemble, but it's impossible to know. Many of the players moved from one band to another band with great regularity. Some of the bigger names to come out of these bands included Ernestine Tiny Davis, Clora Bryant, Helen Jones, Anna Mae Winburn, and Roz Cron. To end discussion of the swing era with U.S. involvement in World War II, as most jazz historiographies do, is to ensure the continued invisibility of all-woman bands. Men, including many jazz musicians from big bands popular in the 1930s, were drafted into the war, and many texts contend that that was the end of big bands. Drummer Viola Smith wrote a downbeat article in 1942 wishing for female instrumentalists to be given a shot. In these times of national emergency, many of the star instrumentalists of the big name bands are being drafted. Instead of replacing them with what may be mediocre talent, why not let some of the great girl musicians of the country take their place? This did happen, but maybe not as readily or easily as the women musicians wished. The dominant swing texts are not gender neutral, although they pass themselves off as such. Living sources willing to give accounts of all-female bands were so easy to reach and so eager to give interviews that Sherry Tucker, the author of Swing Shift, All-Girl Bands of the 1940s, claims that there is no way that the omission of them from the dominant jazz history texts is accidental. Women have purposely been left out of the written history of jazz. Many male musicians, critics, and historians wrote these bands off as a novelty act, not deserving recognition. But there was no place for an all-female band that got by on musicianship alone, rather than looks. In the preparation of her book, Tucker encountered notions that all-girl bands lacked an intangible yet crucial authenticity possessed by men's bands, even at the time of writing. In placing a call to the American Federation of Musicians to gather information in 1999, the man who answered insisted that groups of housewives who got together during the war would not be considered real bands. They wouldn't have been professional, and they wouldn't have belonged to the union. He was obviously incorrect. Tucker had originally embarked to write a short paper on the neglected accomplishments of a few women musicians, because she was not aware of the hundreds of bands that had existed. Instead, she was able to conduct 100 interviews with still living musicians who had played in these bands, many of whom continued their playing careers into the 1990s and 2000s. Her subsequent book is over 400 pages. White bands were often treated more favorably by critics and audiences. Again, a premium was placed on looks over musicianship, but there was no place for a band that didn't look good. One such band was Ina Ray Hutton and her Melodiers. Born Odessa Cowan, Hutton was pressured into changing her name by her vaudeville agent. As she was known, the blonde bombshell of rhythm was a singer and band leader. After the Melodiers broke up, she went on to lead an all-male band and then a second all-female band on her TV show, The Ina Ray Hutton Show, which was aired in Los Angeles before being picked up and played nationally on the Paramount Network from 1951 to 55. Instrumental soloists were also vocalists and did dual duty with the groups they were in. Frances Cline was a trumpet soloist with the Melodiers, and Canadian Ruth Lowe Sandler played piano. Other popular white bands included Ada Leonard and her All-American Girl Orchestra, which, in addition to pianist Ada Leonard, featured Viola Smith on drums and trumpeter Jane Sager, who went on to play with mostly male bands later in her career. The U.S. military also supported 5 all-female bands, 4 white and 1 colored, which were usually led by men who could avoid being drafted into combat roles by entertaining the troops instead. These bands toured extensively throughout the U.S. and Europe. One of the biggest stars to come out of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm was Ernestine Tiny Davis. She was known for her boisterous stage presence and impressive trumpet chops. Davis began playing trumpet at age 13, eventually making her way to Kansas City, where she played with the Harlem Playgirls. In the late 1930s, Davis was separated from her husband and children and answered an ad to join the Sweethearts on tour. She was often described as the heart of the band. Some of the biggest names to be fans of the International Sweethearts, and specifically of Tiny Davis, were Ella Fitzgerald, Count Basie, and Louis Armstrong. At one point, Armstrong reportedly offered Davis 10 times her current salary to leave the Sweethearts and join his band instead. She refused because, as she said, she loved them gals too much. After the war ended, Davis left the International Sweethearts of Rhythm to form her own band, the Helldivers, with former members of the Prairie View Co-eds, the all-girl band at Prairie View College. The Helldivers were the first all-female group to record for Decca Records in the 1950s. They toured extensively, but Davis claimed it was extremely difficult to get work due to the discrimination leveled against her. In addition to being female and black, Davis was also gay and overweight. She continued to play trumpet throughout her life, but also opened her own jazz club in Chicago with her partner Ruby Lucas, bassist in the Helldivers, called Tiny and Ruby's Gay Spot. She has lamented her place in jazz history, wondering whether race, gender, or sexuality may have played a part in why she wasn't better known.
Ain't recorded since 1953. If I was a girl singer instead of horn player, maybe I'd still be cutting records. My picture be in Jet every week. I'd have a spot in Vegas, on Broadway, singing nightly in a New York club, a professor. But it's been one night stand since the war was over. I could have played with Cab, Basie, or the Duke. I was mighty, the sensation of a century, out of this world, supreme, stellar. But it was them girls. White, light, bright, brown, tan, and yellow. Yes, sir. That's who I grind my axe for. Times wasn't ready for us. Still ain't.
Female musicians, much like their male counterparts, often left the U.S. for seemingly greener pastures in Europe. Valaida Snow was one such trumpet player. Nicknamed Queen of the Trumpet by W.C. Handy and proclaimed as the second greatest trumpet player by Louis Armstrong, naming himself as number 1, the worst criticism thrown at her was that she mimicked Armstrong too closely. Her stage presence and brilliant musicianship capture theatergoers who are amazed to find this slender, shapely girl capable of the sort of jazz trumpet that had hitherto been the prerogative, in their minds at least, of such as Louis Armstrong. Again, the focus being on her looks, not being compatible with her sound. Snow came from a musical family. Her mother was a music teacher and father was a minister and choir director. She had 3 sisters and 1 brother, each of whom were singers. She was basically raised on the road and began performing at age 5. By 15, she already played cello, bass, banjo, violin, mandolin, harp, accordion, clarinet, trumpet, and saxophone, as well as singing and dancing. As a black female instrumentalist, Valaida Snow often found it difficult to get regular work in the U.S. She toured Europe, China, and India in the 1920s and 30s. She also got more meaningful long-term work as a singer rather than playing trumpet. She recorded as a vocalist with Earl Hines, but all of her trumpet recordings were made in Europe. Later in life, Snow did play trumpet while on tours with Earl Hines as well. She was in the midst of a Scandinavian tour when war broke out in Europe. She ignored all the warnings that she should return to the US and was trapped in Denmark when the Nazis invaded. The Nazis robbed her of expensive furs and jewelry, as well as the golden trumpet she had been gifted by Queen Wilhelmina. She was imprisoned in a concentration camp in Copenhagen from 1940 to 42, when she was released in a prisoner exchange. At the time of her release, she weighed 68 pounds and was in ill health. After returning to the States, she continued her career, but she never fully recovered from her imprisonment, and her career never had the same success as before the war. She was featured as a soloist with the Count Basie Orchestra in 1945, and she literally worked until her dying day. She played a concert at the Palace Theater in New York in the evening and suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage that night. Valaida Snow was as much an American jazz ambassador of enormous importance abroad as Coleman Hawkins, Fats Waller, Billy Coleman, or Benny Carter, according to historian Antoinette Handy. Elvira Redd was the daughter of jazz drummer Alton Redd, best known as the co-founder and owner of the Clef Club. Her mother was also an amateur saxophonist. Vi Redd began playing alto saxophone at age 12, and by junior high was playing in a group with fellow students Melba Liston and Dexter Gordon. Vi Redd recorded 2 albums as a leader in a time when that market was still controlled by businessmen. The mostly instrumental album Bird Call was released in 1962, and Lady in Soul, on which Redd sang and played, debuted in 1963. She's also featured on Now's the Time with pianist Marion McPartland and guitarist Mary Osborne. The Los Angeles Sentinel in 1962 somewhat begrudgingly said of her, "Miss Redd may well be the first gal horn player in jazz history to establish herself as a major soloist." She was tragically under-recorded, but had an extremely successful touring career. Primarily known as a blues-influenced bebop and hard bop player, Redd toured throughout the US, Europe, Japan, and even played 10 weeks at the famed Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London. Redd spent the end of her career teaching at the University of Southern California. She was a champion for other women in jazz, hosting a concert titled Instrumental Women Celebrating Women in Jazz in 2000. She won the Mary Lou Williams Women in Jazz Award from the Kennedy Center in 2001. Got her start in the Prairie View Coeds, but was one of the most successful bebop soloists to come out of the all-girl band era. She was a member of the first women's jazz group to appear on television. They appeared as the Sepia Tones on KTLA in 1951. She later performed with Ada Leonard's White Band on TV, but was fired after the first week because of audience demand. A black woman performing with a white band was apparently too much. She also spent 6 weeks in 1951 with the all-female sextet led by violinist Ginger Smock that was broadcast on CBS. He was a pivotal figure on Central Avenue, the jazz mecca of the West Coast LA scene in the 1950s. She worked in LA bands that backed Josephine Baker and Billie Holiday, among others. Her only solo recording was Gal with a Horn in 1957. The record label demanded that she sing on every track, but her unique bebop voice on trumpet is what established her as a serious player. She then spent most of the 60s and 70s touring with Dizzy Gillespie and others, but she sang more and more in order to secure gigs. She also became adept at mimicking Louis Armstrong's gravelly singing voice and did impressions of him on stage. In 1988, she was the first female jazz musician to tour the Soviet Union. She stated that as a child, her father taught her that if you want to do something bad enough, you just do it. This attitude led to her writing Mikhail Gorbachev to tell him she wanted to come. In 1975, Bryant also became a composer. Her piece, To Dizzy with Love, was a tribute to her friend and mentor and won much acclaim within the musical community. In 1993, Bryant was asked to play in the Trumpet Summit in memory of Dizzy Gillespie. The other invited soloists were Clark Terry, John Faddis, and Freddie Hubbard. She is the co-editor of the book Central Avenue Sounds about the jazz scene in Los Angeles in the 1940s and 50s. After a heart attack and quadruple bypass surgery in 1996, Bryant retired from playing trumpet, but continued to sing. She received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Mary Lou Williams Women in Jazz Festival at the Kennedy Center in 2002.